So, as Katie said, this particular result is having an identity crisis. It was collected at Apollo 16, but it thinks sometimes that it is from Apollo 11, Apollo 12, or elsewhere. And this is the original title of the talk. I've changed it so slightly, crossed it out, and added 17. So you can probably see where this talk is going to go, but I'll lead you on anyways. So just some previous work about this particular sample. It was collected near the Lunar module site of Apollo 16. It was a rake sample. The sample itself is a polymixed fragmental breccia, which consisted of several different types of class. It had anorthosite, it had basalt class, and it also had several different types of impact melt breccias. Now what we are interested in are these basalt class. Apollo 16 was a highlands site, so any basalt class that we have from it are fairly unusual. So they're really interesting to try to characterize. And these particular basalts have actually been characterized in literature before. One study suggested that they might be Luna 16 type basalts because they were very similar in composition. And others suggested Apollo 11 and Apollo 17 high titanium basalts. But if you notice, these are from 1974, 75, and 76. No other compositional studies, I believe, have been conducted on these basalts since the mid-70s, and a lot has changed since then. So our main objective is to characterize these basalt class using some modern methods. Like I said, a lot has changed. We have two groups of basalts that we were examining. One group is some newly discovered basalt class from January 2010, and I'll show you some pictures from the Lunar Receiving Lab from that trip. We also wanted to re-examine these previously studied basalts using these new methods and see if there is much of a difference. As I said before, we want to use modern methods to look at these samples. We've looked at bulk composition of the rocks. We have aliquots for whole rock analyses that we've conducted, and also mineral analyses. And the whole rock analyses, we conducted them with major elements from ICP OES, so optical emission, and trace elements on the ICP-MS, both at Notre Dame, in solution mode. We've also examined several of the mineral phases within this rock, the olivine, pyroxene, ilmenite, and plagioclase. There are also some bits of metal in there that we have looked at the major elements but not traced. And one of the important things, as I said before, is the Apollo 16 basalts are fairly unusual. There have not been very many found. Just a couple studies, Hughes et al. 1988, Simon et al. 1987, and then as recently as Ziegler et al. In 2006. And this is kind of it. I mean, there's not much out there. Up on the top left is an image that Clive took when we were in the Lunar Receiving Lab. So this is 60639. We have outlined where the basalt class were taken that we discovered. And here in the white is that anorthosite. So like I said, this is a breccia. So it's got lots of different class inside it. On the bottom is a thin section. This is from comma 2, which is the same thin section that was previously examined. So we do actually have the thin section that was examined in the 1970s. And this white line here that I've drawn in is just to help guide your eye a little bit. This thin section has basalt class on the left and breccia on the right. So all of our thin sections that we received had both basalt and breccia portions. It's a fairly coarse-grained basalt. It's fairly feldspathic, but something else that I want you to notice is when we received the aliquots to do the whole rock analyses, we asked for these specific basalt class, and they're pretty tiny. So when we received them, it was not all basalt. There was definitely some breccia mixed in with it. So we had to separate them out to get the analyses that we wanted. So we had some portions that were all basalt. I realize it's a little fuzzy. It's kind of hard to take pictures through the microscope, but when it's a rough surface. Down here we also have some pieces that were all breccia, and then we had some that we could not separate out the basalt from the breccia. So we have 3 different types of samples that we analyzed in whole rock. We have basalt, we have breccia, and then we have the mixture, and you'll see those on these later plots. This is a backscatter electron image and a X-ray map of one of the thin sections, just to give you a better idea of the difference between the basalt and the breccia portions that we'll be looking at. As I said before, it's a fairly coarse-grained rock. About 50% of the basalt is pyroxene, followed by plagioclase, and then there's some olivine and ilmenite. The ilmenite is the bright white that you can see here. If you look at the X-ray maps, and I realize it's a little fuzzy, but you can see these brighter green areas here are the olivines. So green here is magnesium, red is calcium, and blue is silicon. So you can easily see where the olivine pops out as opposed to the pyroxene, which you can't see as well over here in the backscatter. And most high titanium basalts, this is a high titanium basalt, most do not have olivine, so that's a little unusual. But you can also see the pyroxenes here, the plagioclase, and the ilmenite. And here, again, you can see the basalt versus the breccia, and we do have some metal bits like this one that looks like the South Pole, actually. Or a dog, depending on how you look at it. All right, so let's jump into the bulk rock chemistry. Just to look at the major elements. In all the plots, the red stars here will be the basalts. The blue here are going to be the breccia, and the purple, because red and blue make purple, are the mixtures. We have a fairly distinct separation here between the basalts, the breccias, and the mixtures. The breccias seem to be similar in composition to the mixtures, so the mixtures seem to be dominated by the breccia for the most part in the major elements. If we look at the trace elements, again, the red is the basalt, the blue here is the breccia, and the purple is the mixture. We can easily separate these out again. Now there is something a little odd about this plot, which I will show you when it, okay. The mixture does not lie in between the basalt and the breccia and the trace elements, but we'll get to that in a minute, so keep thinking about that. All right, now on to the identity crisis. If we look at the general shape of the rare earth element profile for these basalts, if we look at something called dysprosium star, here you can see lanthanum and ytterbium. If we have a concave down curve between lanthanum and ytterbium for dysprosium star, you're going to have dysprosium star of greater than 1, which is what we see. When we are trying to figure out what type of basalt they are similar to in their abundances of trace elements, this is the plot that we've used. And what we can see is that the basalts from this study are actually fairly similar in overall shape of their rare earth element profile to Apollo 12, which is a little odd. Not really what we were expecting to see. If you look at the breccias, they're very similar to Apollo 14, and the mixtures seem to be in between. Now this similarity with Apollo 12 with the dysprosium star is probably just indicating a dominance of pyroxene in the sample, and with regards to the breccia and Apollo 14, indicates that there might be some creep component in there because creep has been shown to influence the Apollo 14 basalt. Now, it has been said before that there is a possible link between this sample and Apollo 11. These plots on the left here are modified from Ziegler et al. Again, our basalts are shown as the red stars. And I've not included the breccia and the mixture on here because I want to focus on the basalts. So what we see is that they seem to plot with the Luna 16 high alumina basalts and the Apollo 11 and 17 high titanium, which has been seen before, with sodium and iron. If we look at titanium and iron, it seems more like Apollo 11. And I've also included on this plot Ryan Ziegler and others, their basalts, just to show you these are all from Apollo 16. They're fairly different. Our basalts all cluster together. We think that these are all from the same flow. But if you look at all the scatter of the basalts that Ziegler looked at, they're all fairly different. So we seem to have basalts from fairly different places at the Apollo 16 site. I've also included Simon et al. And Hughes et al. So if we think that, okay, it's similar in major elements to the Apollo 11s, we want to delve into that a little bit more. This plot here on the right is taken from Jurdy et al., and I've modified it just a bit. So Dirty et al. Looked at the Apollo 11 high titanium basalt, and we have two fairly distinct groups, and there was this big blank space in between. Our basalts lie right in that nice big blank space, which would seem to indicate that maybe this is some sort of missing link between these two basalt groups, which is fairly interesting. And this single green point is from Ziegler et al. And this point right here actually corresponds to their analysis that's similar to very high titanium glass. So we have something a little odd going on here with some of these basalts. So this would seem to indicate that it's indeed an Apollo 11 basalt. If we look into, and I've not included it here, if we look into the trace elements in greater depth, the abundances don't really seem to fit much beyond the lanthanum, but it's very similar to two Apollo 17 samples, 75015 and 75035. These two basalts are actually fairly distinct from most of the other Apollo 17 basalts, so they're kind of oddballs to begin with. But if we look at the major elements, the basalts, once again, are very similar in composition. We think that they're all likely from the same flow. So these are very similar to the Apollo 17 basalts, and here again. And I've also included the rare earth element profile. The lanthanum, cerium is a little off, but for the most part, they seem to bracket the data from 75015 and 75035 seem to bracket the basalts that we see. So we think that it's fairly likely that they are at least related to these Apollo 17 basalts. So just a little bit of further evidence for Apollo 17. If we compare the major elements of some of the phases that we've examined to some work that's being done by Pat Donahue and Clive Neal, which are these shaded regions here, we can see that although we do have some data that falls out of these regions, we also have quite a bit of overlap. So we think that this is further evidence that these are fairly similar. I've also included on the bottom a field for 75035 for pyroxene from Longy et al. So we have ilmenite here, pyroxene, and plagioclase. I've not included a plot of olivine here because 75015 actually does not have any olivine in it, which is a little bit of a tricky detail here when saying that these are similar. But right now, this seems like it's a pretty good candidate. Now, the next couple of slides are going to explain why geochemists need to be friends with spectroscopy people. Oh, no, sorry. You have to wait. All right, you remember that conundrum that I showed you at the beginning about the mixture not really mixing? So the purple here is the mixture, and the red is the average basalt. And then we have these two different Breccia samples that we analyzed. And as you see, the mixture does not fit in between. However, if we mix in with the Breccia and the basalt, if we add in some anorthosite, and I've plotted here a plagioclase crystal from another Apollo 16 sample, and we mix the three together, we actually get a pretty good fit. So if we take about 20% basalt, 61% Breccia, and 19% of that anorthosite, we get this dashed black line, and you can even barely see the lavender that's underneath it. It's fitting really well. Similarly, if we use the other Breccia, again, we can get a very good fit. So we think that the reason that this is not fitting exactly in between is just because we're incorporating some anorthosite, which is actually fairly logical since we're in a highlands location. Now, why you need to be friends with spectroscopy people. This is a figure that was taken from Ziegler et al. This is the Apollo 16 site. And if you recall, the titanium and iron content of our samples, we're looking at something in this yellow region for titanium. The nearest Mare basalt is Nectaris, and we don't see the similar composition. Same thing with the iron. We need something up around 19. We're looking at something more up here and not Nectaris. So we said that it was similar in composition to several of the different samples. All right, in the green star is Apollo 16. I've just drawn a line here. These are images from Gillis et al. For Apollo 17, right here and right here. Apollo 11, and then Apollo 12, so you can kind of see where the similarities might exist. And once again, it's most similar in composition, fairly far away from Apollo 16's site, pretty close to Apollo 17, probably in between Apollo 11 and 17. Probably Mare Serenitatis, or even over here at Oceanus Procellarum, but we need to delve into that a little bit more. And I think this is a good example of, Noah mentioned at the Next Gen workshop that we had a geochemist and a spectroscopist talking together, and this is actually what we were talking about. I think it's very important that we all get together and cooperate a little bit, because it would be really neat to find out if we could figure out where this basalt came from. And then that could go into the cratering community and modeling and see if that helps trying to figure out how any of this ejecta is transported across the surface of the moon. So in summary, I think that these basalts all came from a single flow. They're very similar in composition. Also that the bulk compositions are similar from basalts from other sites. The general rare earth element profile is similar from Apollo 12, which likely just indicates the dominance of pyroxene. The Apollo 11 and 17 have very similar major elements, which I've shown you on that figure of the spectroscopy data, that it may have come from Mare Serenitatis in between, but it's actually very similar to 75015 and 75035 in both major and trace elements in the bulk composition, as well as major elements of some of the individual mineral phases. And finally, that mixture that we thought was a bit of a problem isn't really a problem. We think we've solved that by just mixing in some anorthosite with the breccia and the basalt. And again, trying to figure out the actual origin, I think, is a good example of when we need, I hate to say it, synergy. But I think it's a great example of how we need to work together to solve some of these problems. And with that, I also would like to thank the Lunar Science Institute for funding for this project. I think it's really important. And with that, I'll take questions. Larry.
Yeah, Amy, very good. Just a point, you showed Apollo 17, you jumped to Apollo 17, then you showed the trace element data. And the first thing that struck me is, hey, you've made up your mind. I didn't see any Apollo 11 data to compare it with.
Right.
I believe it's Apollo 11.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. We've looked at Apollo 16 soils in great detail, and we looked at various size fractions of those. And we see something like maybe 25% of a Mare component in the soils. Mm-hmm. Okay? And the closest place that you're going to get this type of stuff is from 11. It's right around the corner. Okay? And so I think it's probably more about 11. I think you might be pushing it a bit without all the rest of the trace element data.
I did actually look at the some of the rare earth element profiles for several of the 11 basalts, and you're right, I neglected to put it up. The fit is not nearly as good as these two Apollo 17 samples, but I will certainly go into it in greater detail to convince you.
Yeah. And one other thing, a lot of what we thought were basalts, for Apollo 16 turned out to be melt rocks.
Right.
Okay? We really didn't appreciate the importance of melt rocks until Apollo 14. Apollo 14 came so fast we didn't even have a meeting for Apollo 14. Okay? We had one for Apollo 12 and Apollo 16 or Apollo 15, and then 16, 17 came, and it wasn't until a couple of years after Apollo 14 that we appreciated melt rocks. And so I think a lot of what we can be seeing is melt rocks. Now, 14310, which is the classic of the melt rocks, mm-hmm. has a particular texture. It does not mean that all melt rocks have to have that texture. That texture was from a memory of having been crystalline before it was shock melted. Okay, it doesn't mean that all the other melt rocks. It's a question of how far above the liquids it gets taken to erase those signatures. So I think there's a lot of things we're calling melt rocks, or calling igneous rocks that are melt rocks. And that's why we came up with the idea of looking at iridium in these, so we can tell the pristinity of them. And, there's a lot of things to be done, that's for sure.
Absolutely, I agree. All right,
And with that, we will conclude this session and head back over to the main room for the Student Poster Awards.